So welcome to Hands On. My name's Alana. I work at the Innovation Cluster as the Operations and Events Manager there. So for those of you who do not know about the Innovation Cluster, we're a not-for-profit organization that works with startups. We work with startups specifically working in technology. But with that being said, all of our workshops are open to the public. We are also part of the Team PTPO group. So that is some of the logos and organizations you're seeing on your screen right now. We work tightly with them on collaborating to make workshops like this happen. I'd like to say thank you for joining us again to this virtual hands-on stress and coping during the pandemic with Lee Smith. So some of the learning objectives today are how humans are affected, how chronic stress affects our bodies and our minds and our behavior. And Lee is also going to provide some guidance on how to navigate those things. There will be a Q&A at the end of the presentation. I'm going to enable the chat box in your Zoom chat so that you can put your questions in there, and then I will read them to Lee and he will answer them for you. And there will also be a survey sent out after the session to touch on what you liked, what we can improve on, what you would like to see. There has been discussion about doing more than one of these workshops and creating more of a series. So let us know what you think about that. But I'm going to pass it over to Lee now.
Hello, everyone. I am tempted to say it's good to see you, but that wouldn't be accurate and true. But it is true to say that I'm glad to be here to use an opportunity to talk to a lot of people in the community about this experience of being human now under the conditions of a couple of experiments that we find ourselves in. We are, of course, in the conditions of the pandemic that involves all manner of different kinds of threat to our health, to our financial well-being, great questions about what the future will be like, as well as experiencing and embracing the conditions of self-isolation and keeping each other safe by removing ourselves from circulation. This is also happening in another situation that could also be considered a global experiment that none of us signed up for, where 10 to 15 years ago, a variety of internet platforms and the development and acquisition of a gazillion smartphones has all worked to change our communication, our social connections, how we are living our lives. And that is an experiment that is unfolding, and there's much to talk about there with respect to stress, with respect to our hardiness, and probably even with respect to the growth of unprecedented levels of experienced loneliness and anxiety and depression. So the terrain here is full. It can't be covered in any short period of time. And I don't want to mislead anybody into supposing that there are quick fixes on offer. Being a human being is remarkably complex and troublesome enterprise often, and I'm afraid most of us are rather ill-equipped to work with our life and our mind, largely because we don't know very much about it. Let me just ask, could I have a show of hands? Who out there has a mind? Anybody have a mind? The best answer I've ever heard to that question is somebody said, no, I lost mine a while ago. But all of us sort of have this clear sense that we have a mind. But let me ask you this now. In your whole life, how much guidance and training and education and direction have you ever had about what it is to have a mind and how to work with it? I think most of us kind of recognize not so much. So there's this remarkable cultural shortfall whereby we all have these minds, but we really haven't had much by way of acquaintance with what they really are and how they really work. The other thing is that we have these minds that walk about through the day doing all kinds of things and rarely encounter any evidence that there is a brain. And we tend to take possession of and feel that we are responsible for what is going on in our mind. So it is consequentially pretty helpful to learn a lot of things about minds and to learn a lot of things about brains, so that we can perhaps get some leg up on how to work with the phenomena of mind and brain. And much of the troublesome stuff that we need to understand better and better is stress. So what I want to take on in this survey with you is to look at what stress is all about, what stress is neurobiologically, and in a neuroendocrine sense, and to learn about the important distinction between acute stress and chronic stress. And chronic stress is the problem that we really need to unpack and refine our abilities to understand and explore. Stress is something that is a whole organism response to a perception of threat that optimizes the resources in the body and in the brain, in the mind, to react to that threat in the most optimal possible way. We see the basic stress response mediated by the autonomic nervous system and by our endocrine system in mammals, in birds, in fish, in reptiles. So there's nothing new here. The problem, as we will talk about, is chronic stress. And at the level of we sapiens and other primates, we have acquired capacities to generate and drive a lot of stress through a mind that worries and through relationships by which we drive each other often quite crazy and to distraction. So in terms of acute stress, which is the reaction in the moment to a real or perceived stress, let's suppose that you are a zebra on the savannah and the proverbial lion suddenly appears. The more rapidly that zebra can begin to, in this case, flight, because stress is associated with flight, fight, maybe freeze responses. Tend and befriend is sort of the fourth form of automatic stress response. But the zebra's job is to muster as rapid a reaction as possible to get away from that lion and to persist in escape for as long as is possible to save its life. So immediately within a second or two, parts of the brain, the amygdala, reacts to the perception of this threat, and the amygdala signals a structure deeper down the brain called the hypothalamus, which then secretes hormones that make its way quickly to the pituitary, and the pituitary starts to send hormonal messages to the adrenal glands at the top of the kidneys to secrete hormones. But in the first second or two, that amygdala structure, which is sort of deep in the temporal lobes on both sides of the brain, will signal directly structures in the brainstem to turn on the sympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system. None of this is going to be on the exam. You're just fine. But get the sense that there's this nervous system-based reaction to a threat that right away starts increasing heart rate. It increases blood pressure as blood starts coming more quickly through the vessels, so blood stroke volume increases. And the nervous system, the sympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system, also directs blood away from areas that it's not needed and towards areas where it will be needed. So lots of blood goes to the big muscles in the body, the legs, the core, the arms, to do the work so that more oxygen and nutrients can get to the muscles to get the job done. Blood is directed away from the gastrointestinal system. You just don't need to be digesting your breakfast if something else is going to first be digesting you. So digestion is kind of shut down, reproductive system is shut down, and the resources are directed where they're needed. You will find that quite quickly if somebody jumps out at you. You'll notice rapidly that your heart rate is up, you can feel your pulse in your neck, blood pressure is high, and all of that is to the good. Maybe 20 to 30 seconds later, cortisol and adrenaline hit the bloodstream. Cortisol is a glucocorticoid hormone. It's really cheap to make, and it is released in the vascular system, and it goes all over the place. You and I are made up of, 100 trillion cells. And as we'll maybe talk about a little bit later, I mean, almost all of these cells are affected by chronic stress. In the short term, what cortisol does is enhance the functioning of a collection of systems that are really beneficial to dealing with the fight at hand or the issue at hand. You can think of the nervous system response as the rapid marshaling of resources, and that cortisol and the neuroendocrine response is something that's for the long term, which might be a couple of minutes, or it could be days, or it could be weeks, or even more chronic than that. Cortisol released into the bloodstream has effects on the immune system. It might be the case that in any kind of fight or flight situation where there is a threat to well-being, there could be an injury that the individual or the critter survives, but subsequently could succumb to infection and complications. So right away, the stress reaction is potentiating an immune response in case there is injury. Cortisol, Cortisol also has effects on platelets in the circulating blood to make them a bit stickier, to help with wound repair. Cortisol, which is a glucocorticoid, is also targeting the liver, and there is a massive cash out of resources so that as much sugar as possible is emptied from the liver to hit the bloodstream, so that we've got lots of resources to keep those muscles running. Cortisol also has effects by quickly crossing the blood-brain barrier and potentiating function in a collection of neurobiological structures. One of them is called the hippocampus. The hippocampi are two curly kinds of structures deep in the temporal lobes that are important for memory, and particularly our autobiographical memory. So that memory that we have of what happened yesterday, what's happening now, is coded as something occurring at this point in time and space. It gives us a sense of cogency and clarity when we think about our life. So it helps with autobiographical memory and the memory of skills. It helps with planning. So it's a kind of a station where a lot of integration of different kinds of information is coordinated. The hippocampi are also involved in stress downregulation. So it is critically involved in helping our system recover after difficulty has arisen. So the hippocampus is potentiated there. That is why we often see, if there's been a critical incident that has really scared us, like a small T or a big T trauma, where we just absorb all of the information available about that incident. And subjectively, that can be like time slowing down and just absorbing everything that's going on, the things that we see, the things we hear, tactile information, the coding of emotion and thought. The whole record is retained. You can imagine that if you have an encounter with a bear, 80,000 years ago, and you survive, it can be really helpful to have learned everything you could about that event that may have threatened your life, so that if you have any similar encounters in the future, that information is held and you don't have to keep going back to school because you might not live through the next class. So the hippocampus, potentiated by cortisol, starts to tuck away as much information about the situation at hand as possible. There is also a potentiation of functioning in the amygdala. The amygdala tends to benefit from cortisol, and the amygdala not only activating the stress response when there's a threat, it is also the place where our feelings of fear and horror and terror and anxiety come from. So that critical structure of the emotional part of the brain, where we experience a threat and we have the emotional accompaniments of that support the motivation to deal with this threat, is also potentiated by cortisol. Cortisol also has effects on the gastrointestinal system. It tends to down-regulate self-repair. It tends to push off to the side human growth hormone that is involved in regulatory health. And what else does cortisol do? It has an effect on the cardiovascular system to help continue with the work of supplying lots of blood to the parts of the body that need it. All of that is to the good. The zebra runs to safety. And when safety is recognized, other branches of the nervous system, the parasympathetic nervous system, kicks in, and it starts to help the body to restore itself. And as cortisol is starting to leave the system, it often leaves behind a bit of an appetite, a little bit of appetite that allows or encourages the zebra or you or I to graze or eat a little bit more to replace the stores that have just been burned through that particular event. So acute stress is really good, and we love acute stress. We pay money to have that system tweaked and turned on. We go to Wonderland. We love horror films. We love plot twists in books that suddenly grab our attention. So that controlled and short-lived experience of stress is desirable, it's fun, but of course we've got the security of knowing that it's just temporary, or it's probably really, really safe. The difficulty is chronic stress. Chronic stress is not the situation you might imagine where stress is just turned on all the time and I'm just stressed out at this level every day to the max. Chronic stress instead is a sawtooth reaction where stress is turned on, then it downregulates, then something else comes on and it downregulates. And through the day, we see this on and off of the stress reaction. And that can begin as soon as we wake up in the morning. We are not beings that are still kicking around 80,000 years ago. We are beings that have a sapient brain, and we have the bodies that were developed over the course of millions of years with last-minute refinements for our brains happening maybe 80 to 100,000 years ago, when we were living in the food chain in small tribes and groups. But now, as modern brutes, we are working with the ancestral product in these modern times. So just to wake up in the morning is something that can evoke a stress response. Our first thought may be, oh no, I can't believe I've got to go to that meeting today. Or, you just had a fight with your sister and you're thinking, what am I going to do with this today? You get up and you step on the cat's tail, and then the coffee maker isn't working. And then you realize that you're late. I mean, we may experience acute stress reactions multiple times in the course of the first 10 minutes of the day. And so the day may go. Each time the stress system turns on and turns off, there is a cost. You can imagine that there is an interest rate that is paid every time we cash out the glucose from the liver, or every time we shut down the gastrointestinal system by diverting blood and resources away from it to the big muscles in the body. You may not be surprised to understand then that a lot of our health difficulties, maybe some estimates are 60 to 80% of the presentations to our general practitioner physicians is in relation to problems and diseases and difficulties that are associated directly or indirectly to stress. For example, chronic stress, it may be a great thing to have high blood pressure so that you can run away from a lion, but to have high blood pressure because of a 30-year stressful marriage can be a real problem to your health. To spend long periods of time in your life with self-repair and tissue regeneration put aside, that can result in significant increases in mortality and morbidity. We know that gastrointestinal problems are commonly associated with chronic stress. People may experience irritable bowel syndrome. They have crampiness. They may have problems with stools and things like that. It can also exacerbate Crohn's disease and other kinds of gastrointestinal maladies. Ulcer is associated with people who are stressed, not just people who suffer the helicobacterium that is associated with ulcer. We also know that chronic stress is associated with a variety of different immunological problems. People who are chronically stressed can have a greater vulnerability to opportunistic bugs that are coming by. So more vulnerability to colds, more vulnerability to infections. People who are more stressed before surgery often have a greater incidence of complications in post-surgical recovery, and there can be more time to heal tissue. It's also associated with autoimmune disease. There was a large-scale Australian study, for example, that found that those women in this study that presented with a first incidence of rheumatoid arthritis had much more stress in the 2 years prior to that presentation than women who controls that did not present with the arthritis. It's associated with lupus and other kinds of disturbances. There are neurobiological effects associated with chronic stress and chronically high levels of cortisol. And I would add that I think at this time during this pandemic, we are probably seeing a population that is experiencing, elevated levels chronically of cortisol, hypercortisolemia. If you're at a cocktail party virtually sometime soon, you want to drop a multisyllabic word, hypercortisolemia. People are having high levels of cortisol. When we have elevated levels of cortisol chronically, that is bad news for parts of the brain. The hippocampus, that friend of ours that does so much by way of regulating us and helping us remember our life and to organize ourselves and to plan, is adversely affected by these elevated levels of cortisol. And the effects can be seen at microscopic levels all the way through to the gross morphology and the overall size of the hippocampus. People who are chronically stressed and are somewhat awash in cortisol, we find that the cortisol can be somewhat cytotoxic. It affects the cells in the hippocampus that is just full of all kinds of receptors for this stuff. It tends to affect the support cells, the butlers and maids in the hippocampus, the glia and the astrocytes that help with the metabolic activity of the cells in the hippocampus. And the cells can start to wither. A typical neuron is something that has a lot of arborizations. Sort of imagine trees in the winter with all of the different branches. And all of this branching extending out into space is the receptive field where neurons can be in communication with other neurons. We see that the neurons in the hippocampus are often pruned and blunted back. And there can be cell death, so loss of neurons in the hippocampus. And furthermore, neurogenesis, which is the ongoing birth of new functional cells, and we're generally producing about 10,000 new cells a day in the hippocampus. Neurogenesis stops. So we have a reduction in cells, we have impoverished functioning in the cells, and ultimately that shows a decrease in the size of the hippocampi. What this is associated with is poorer cognitive abilities. We may feel foggier. We can't concentrate as well. Our ability to pay attention is poorer. We may feel more challenged to organize a busy day or to even organize the preparation of a moderately complicated recipe. And our capacity to downregulate stress is somewhat impaired, so we become even more vulnerable to stress reactions. We also see that chronic stress has effects on parts of the frontal lobes, the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is the place where our humanness is most robustly mediated. Our humanness in terms of our moral reasoning, in terms of the effort that it can take to do the right thing, even when the right thing is a hard thing to do. Our knowledge of the world, our complex understanding of interpersonal relationships. The frontal lobes are the last to mature in the brain, sometime in our mid-20s. And that might be because that is when, or that allows the largest and longest period of time for all the complexity of being a human to be integrated and consolidated. Well, cortisol tends to selectively interfere with the emotional reasoning parts of the prefrontal cortex so that we start becoming less compassionate, less empathic. Our emotional decision-making is poorer. You know, if you've ever walked into a party and you're reminding yourself, okay, don't say that thing about, and then we walk in and we say that thing. Oh, we do a Homer Simpson. Homer Simpson probably has problems with his dorsomedial prefrontal cortex. And that can be the effect for us as well under conditions of chronic stress. And more bad news, the amygdala, that place that turns on rapidly in response to any kind of real or perceived threat, is potentiated by cortisol. We see that the metabolic activity in the amygdala is greater in people who are chronically stressed. Fear conditioning is something that can happen more quickly. And when you put people's heads in brain scanners and you compare the brains, and particularly the amygdala of chronically stressed people compared to people who are not stressed out, you see that the amygdala will fire when people are exposed to neutral stimuli. So a neutral face, instead of an angry face or a scared face, a neutral face will lead to the firing of the amygdala or anything that's ambiguous. So now we become hair trigger responders with more stress to things that typically wouldn't have set us off before, or that only set us off and don't set off other people. We also see health effects in the cardiovascular system with chronic stress. It is very clear that chronic hypertension is associated with risk to cardiovascular illness and stroke. We also know that those sticky platelets that were there for acute stress so that we can repair wounds can result in a vulnerability to atherosclerotic developments. The plaques and the substances that can stick to the inside of veins, that can be the stuff that can give rise to heart attack going forward. There's other effects. I mean, it affects us down to the level of mitochondria. think back to grade 9 biology, and mitochondria are the little organelles that are contained in all of the cells in the body, which support energy systems and also regulate RNA's synthesis of proteins directed by DNA. That can go a little bit awry. And even if we get out a really big magnifying glass and look more carefully, we can even see that cortisol affects these bundling systems on chromosomes called telomeres. Telomeres are complexities of repeats on the ends of chromosomes that seem to regulate how many times a cell can replicate in the course of a lifetime. And so in that way, telomeres play a big role in lifespan and our vulnerability to illness. Cortisol adversely affects the functioning of telomerase, an enzyme that looks after the health of the telomeres. And so as a result, people who are chronically stressed have shorter telomeres. And that has implications for mortality and morbidity. On and on. There's so much work looking at stress and chronic stress and allostasis and stress-related illness. There's lots that we could go into, but I'm concerned about my audience falling asleep without being monitored. So let me move along a little bit. But to summarize, chronic stress is a peril for all of us. The good news is it's very workable. But what we have to do is get a bit of an understanding of what chronic stress is as it shows up in our life, and to develop ways of working with that. I'm reminding myself that another effect of chronic stress is that it is associated with the development of anxiety and even depression. The neuroscience is pretty clear that if we are going to talk about anxiety, we really are talking about the stress reaction as it unfolds and concatenates over time going forward. And when we are chronically stressed and we're just experiencing ourselves trapped in a life where there's nothing I can do and I can't escape the conditions that are at hand, and as we'll talk about, my mind is just full of all kinds of negative, difficult thoughts, we can start to feel entrapped. We can start to feel helpless. We can start to feel defeated by our life as we're seeing it. And as a consequence, and this is quite associated with the wear and tear and the diminishment of functioning in the hippocampus, that is associated with the development of depression. So the effects are legion and considerable, and looking at stress is key to addressing our experiences of anxiety and depression. Further, whenever we are suffering something that feels unpleasant, what are the common things that we do when we encounter something that feels unpleasant? Usually we want to get away from it. We want to make it stop. We want to do something that will change how our mind and how our body and how our emotions are feeling to us. And so as a consequence, the persistence of stress and the unpleasantness of the thoughts or the memories or the perspective that are at hand, we may find that, that glass of wine really helped last night, or it really helps right now. This feels great. Or we might find that we could lose ourselves in gambling, or we can lose ourselves in work. And as long as we're working and persisting in this, that feels better. Or if we continue to persistently check our email and distract ourselves with the technology at hand, that is a way of regulating our difficulties. We can go to the casino. The use of porn is related to people's psychological pain. Our vulnerability to addictions, given the brains that we have, lead us to perhaps start leaning on weed a little bit more, or it makes us vulnerable to trying other things that provide some relief. So this mind of ours and these lives of ours can lend themselves to states of existence that may be anywhere from mild to pretty severe and consequential going forward. But it's that accrual over time that we often just do not see. It's very difficult to pick up things that are ambient and ongoing. There's a story about one day, two young fish were swimming along, and coming towards them was an older fish. And as they passed each other, the older fish said to the younger fish, "Good morning, boys. How's the water?" A few moments later, one of the younger fish turned to the other one and said, "What the hell is water?" The point here is that the things that we are commonly experiencing and immersed in may be things that we haven't even recognized, things that we haven't even acknowledged. They haven't registered in our consciousness. And as a consequence, there's not much that we can learn about them or do with them. And there's another analogy that has certainly a quality of cruelty to it, but it's just an analogy. This has never been done, I'm sure. If you take a perfectly good frog and you put a frog in a pot of water out of the tap, and you put that pot on the stove, and then you turn the heat on, what do you think the frog will do? The frog just stays there. The frog is unable to detect the gradual increase in water temperature until it dies. And we can be like that with the stressors in our life, with the conditions in our life that are stable and commonplace, even if they are somewhat deleterious, even if they occasion chronic stress. So let's have a look at where and when stress is happening. Would you accept that it is completely true that everything that's ever happened in your life, from the time of your birth, maybe even from before birth, through your childhood, through high school, all the way up till now, that everything in your life that has ever happened to you has already happened, and there's nothing you can do about that? It's already happened, and it's in the books, right? I think you'll think that's true. And do you have any subjective sense of being able to just go back in time a little bit and make a change? Not so much. So here we are now, and the past is clearly and permanently behind us. Ahead of us is the future. Do you have any sense at all of, if you really think about this, knowing what is going to be happening at 5 o'clock today? We don't really know. We know at 5 o'clock there's going to be certain conditions, hopefully, that still prevail. We'll still be in our house. We'll still be, following the temporal routines of the day. But we don't know what's going to be happening. You don't even know what's going to be happening. I don't even know what's going to be happening in 3 seconds. So as a result, the only place that we live, the only place that we ever inhabit in a reality-based sense, is the present moment. And this is why the present moment and stuff you may have heard in the media about now is such a big, hairy deal. You and I, we are all carbon-based life forms, and we are all present moment-based life forms. Now is when we can work on our life. But rarely are we, in some subjective sense, residing in the present moment. Most often our minds wander. Minds wander into the future, running all kinds of scenarios, imaginings. In fact, that's really what worry is. Worry is about the mind, the amygdala, generating whole complex movies about what is going to happen tomorrow, about what is going to happen just in a couple of minutes or next year. Okay? And these movies are suffused with emotion. They're rich. They're, 8-dimensional. They are. They involve embodied feelings, because our bodies are always being lit up by what we're thinking and what we're feeling. And the movies are incredibly compelling because they contain all of this emotion. They contain incredibly detailed reference to what we know about our life from the past. They draw on our history, and they unapologetically offer up a fiction because we just can't know the future. But because they're so seductive, and because this is a big part of the water, the part of the life experience that we never really see and recognize, we don't pause and ask questions like, is that true, or am I just imagining this? Our mind, our brain can just dupe us into immersive plays of all kinds of worrisome scenarios. That is stress. So if we're not in the present moment, if we are not paying attention to what is my mind doing right now, then that is going to be something that we're not going to recognize and see. And so there's no way we can regulate it. There's no way we can learn about it. Another place that minds love to hang out is in the past, going over, why did I say that? Oh, what are they going to be thinking about me? Oh no, this is terrible. How am I ever going to face my brother again, or that coworker again? We try to negotiate, we try to change our past, and it becomes a very compelling pastime and preoccupation. We can suffer 1,000 times one perhaps regrettable and certainly understandable experience. That is also stress. That is also another way in which we can get the heart pumping, we can get the cortisol going, we can make the platelets sticky, and we can hurt our brains and our bodies mightily. So again, it's in the present moment that we can notice what's on my mind. It's in the present moment that we can take some stock of what is happening and learn a little bit about our reactions. That's where we can operate on things. Here's one way of kind of setting that up. In terms of the opportunities that are and are not afforded to us. Maybe a short while ago, you had your lunch, right? Are you doing a good job digesting your lunch? Are you really making sure that those particular chemicals, those particular amino acids make their way down to your ankle and head off to your ear to give you a nice cushion of earwax? I mean, of course not. We're not built that way. Digestion, the functioning of our liver, our pancreas, these are all automatic systems that just function unintentionally. They just happen automatically through the day. We breathe in and out all day. All day you've been breathing in and out. All night you've been breathing in and out. And it's just something that happens automatically. But the way we're built is if you pay attention to your breath, then you've got control. You're now the boss. On the count of 3, let's all breathe in together. Ready? 1, 2, 3. We can all do that. But as soon as our mind wanders, the breath goes back to its automatic process. Here's the point. All day long, the brain thinks. Brains think, they crunch away. Estimates are the brains have 65 to 80,000 thoughts a day. And you're not doing that. You are not running your brain. Brains do this. They create imaginings of the future. They interrogate what other people are thinking of us. We form judgments relentlessly. We have wars of opinion that are being fought all the time. And we're not doing that. But when we pay attention, when we just pause and ask, what's on my mind right now? Then we can actually hold things in a bit of a freeze frame. We can look and see and know what's on our mind. We can notice, wow, I was really worried about how, this meeting is going to be today. We can pause and go, yeah, but I really don't know what it's going to be like. I'm working myself up into a froth. I've got this appointment at 4 o'clock. and I really don't know what it's going to be about. And that provides a little bit of space, a little bit of room in which we can be in relation to what we're thinking, observing it. We can learn about it, and we can mediate that. We can be in a regulatory relationship to our thought in that moment. Okay. Moreover, when we are paying attention to what we're thinking or what we're feeling or how things come up in the body, I often notice for myself when I'm feeling anxious or stressed that there's a feeling in the chest or sometimes in the belly or maybe in the jaw. There's many places where our bodies will have available to us a tell about what's going on. And when we pause, that becomes a place where we can look and explore what's happening right now. And very often if we ask simple questions like, okay, so I've got this feeling that I'm an idiot, or that people aren't going to like me, or whatever it may be. And we can pause and ask, okay, so that's a powerful feeling and I can see the thought, but is that a true thought? Do I really know that that's what people are thinking of me, or is that a worry? Because a lot of our thinking is not based in reality. It's imagined. All of this thought, all of this associative work, all of this rumination that stresses us out and occasions an awful lot of the elevation of our cortisol is not based in reality. It's based in this robust mind and its capacity to imagine. But when we can stop and take that pause and that time out, we might be able to mediate a little bit and recognize this is a thought. It's not a veridical depiction of reality and the truth. It's just a mental event. So paying attention in this present moment, opening up that space where we can see what we're feeling, or we can just pause for a moment and see that this attention, this ability to pay attention, opens up some bandwidth that we can use to learn and to experience. That becomes a remarkably valuable ally in working with and in down-regulating our stress. I mean, these days in isolation with the pandemic and so much that needs to be learned still before we can understand a safe way forward so that people can come out of isolation and businesses can get running again. So much of these days, we will notice our mind is craning its virtual neck to try and get some glimpse of the future so that we can know what's coming. And as we scan the headlines for indications of how bad it is, as we try to see what our leaders are offering us, as we look at or imagine the toll this is going to be taking on our finances, our health, our hearts, we can work ourselves into a fair amount of stress. Cortisol is something that also can affect the quality of our sleep, and it can undermine restorative sleep. All of this is a grim picture that going forward gives us no way of having control, and we find ourselves on a slippery slope that can lead us to more anxiety, vulnerability to panic. We begin to drink more. I've heard of the COVID-19 now being offered in reference to the 19 pounds that we're going to gain during isolation. So the benefits of beginning to monitor and to learn how to watch our mind and to learn about what our mind is doing can be incredibly helpful in working with stress. And moreover, the History Channel is always on. Our childhood, our family of origin, the people that we've lost in our life, any early childhood adversity, any traumas that we've suffered, all of these things can begin to show up increasingly during times of chronic stress. We may start to have intrusive remembrances of past bad experiences. We may be more unsettled in our sleep. The form and the nature of our thought and feelings of vulnerability can increasingly be populated by what we know about vulnerability in the past that we haven't come to terms with. So again, to be able to see what the content is of our mind and to develop skills to accept what's here because it's here, to learn to turn towards the things that feel unpleasant instead of leaning heavily on perhaps the customary methods of avoidance and escape and denial and distraction, the better off we will be to do the work of coming to terms with past difficulty and to learn how our life, our worries are coming up so that we can work with the ways in which we've been hacked, work with the ways in which our mind has been hacked by all that teasing we suffered in grade 10, whatever it may be. I'm just going to have a quick drink and have a brief consultation with myself. Let's see how we're doing for time. We're approaching 1 o'clock, and I wanted to spend maybe an hour going over stress, human minds, and this business of the present moment. So before we move on to questions, I just want to emphasize a couple of pieces. The stress in our life is workable. All the wear and tear that we may be suffering in our bodies from chronic stress, it's workable, it's addressable. There's a lot of things that we can do for ourselves. So I hope that what I've summarized so far hasn't been evocative of more stress, although I can certainly understand how it might have been. But the good news is we can make big differences in our life. I do want to quickly hasten to add that making changes in our life is not something that is subject to quick fixes. As much as so much of the North American media and news cycle and self-help has led us to imagine and to be told that just do this for 5 minutes and you'll feel great. To really develop skills and strengths in living in more rewarding and healthy ways, that involves an application of a lot of time and a lot of practice. But again, if you look at your physical health, we know the things that we might do that can increase our physical health. We can, work on our diet, and that takes time and it takes research. We could work on our physical health through exercise. Even a couch potato could conceivably run 5 kilometers, but not today and not next week. But with starting to walk and then brief jogs and keeping that up, in 6 months, our couch potato could be running a very enjoyable 5 kilometers. So one thing is that change is possible, but it does take persistence and it takes practice. If you're going to learn to play piano, you have to practice. And whenever we practice something new, there are some considerable startup costs associated with embracing novelty and the uncertainty and encountering how perhaps poorly we may be doing, encountering all the judgment that can derail us in pursuing things that might be really helpful. Our ability to pay attention in the present moment is something that can be strengthened, and we can develop terrific skills in paying attention a lot and frequently and durably during the course of the day by practicing this act of paying attention in the present moment, non-judgmentally, for many minutes a day, 15, 30 minutes a day. And the practice, the gymnasium that we can go into to work this ability out, is called mindfulness meditation. Mindfulness meditation is something that the Buddha 2,600 years ago began to teach his followers, and a lot of Buddhist psychology and research and teachings over those intervening 2,600 years have been dedicated to refinements, many of which are now being investigated and elaborated and refined in North American neuroscience and psychology. in Western neuroscience. And there's much to teach and learn there. But the basic practice of mindfulness meditation, and there's a ton of it on the internet, is to find some target that you can pay attention to and to follow that target, such as the breath, which unfolds in real time, and to follow the breath as best you might. But I promise you, in the first 5 or 10 seconds, the mind will probably start to wander. In the interest of making room for questions and answers, I won't take more time now about teaching mindfulness meditation here to the present audience, but that might be something that we could look at doing together down the road. And it's also something that I could provide you with lots of direction. And there's already all kinds of direction on the internet that you can pursue independently to begin to practice. And remember, though, that the mind is always going to wander. If you do put a toe in the deep end and you want to start to practice this, you will have the experience of being unable to sustain your attention. And that's normal. It's a part of having a brain that is just a wild ride. And even if you practice for weeks and months, you're going to continue to see your mind being unruly. That's how minds are. You're not failing. We are not meditating to get better at meditating. We're meditating to get better at living. And as we do develop our practice more and more, and it's the hours that matter, there's no shortcuts, we start finding that this awareness of what am I thinking now, or what was I about to say that for, starts becoming a more common part of how we are living our life and downregulating our stress. I also want to add that many of the basics can be very, very helpful in terms of increasing our resilience, our hardiness, and in downregulating our chronic stress. Exercise, the science is really clear that exercise is hugely beneficial as an opportunity for the body to release and express a lot of its pent-up tension. And it also helps with restorative sleep. And it also does a lot of things in our neuroendocrines that decrease the effect or the amount of cortisol in our body. Diet is huge. The more we eat carbs, the more we eat sugar, the more we're disturbing our gastrointestinal system, which turns out to also be in a co-regulatory relationship with our brain and our body that can go kaflooey and exacerbate our stress or help us work with it more heartily and beneficially. So pay attention to diet. There's lots to talk about in terms of the phenomena of our smartphones and how our smartphones are really changing the quality of our connection to other people. That, you know, your husband doesn't ding you, but your smart apps do. And it just continually takes us away. It turns out that in truth, we are not suffering a time famine. We have all kinds of time, but it's something that's, somebody talks about it as being confettied, that we have all kinds of small pieces of time because our smartphone, our panic scroll through our media while we're standing in line to get a coffee back in the good old days. Keeps us from connecting with other people. And even just those short hellos are incredibly helpful to our sapient brains going forward. So much more to talk about. I hope this gives you a bit of a flavor and an initial bit of an orientation to the problem of having a human mind, to some of the nature of human suffering. I do hope you take away from this that it is very clearly workable, even though our mind may be telling us that it is not. That is also illusory. And I'll look forward to taking questions now and coming back to touch on some of these things. And also to point out that you know, this content about our psychology and about our physiology and about our stress responses, about mindfulness meditation and other ways of working with the problem of devices, these are things that we can go over iteratively. There's a massive complexity here, and there's no way that we can do a good job, that I could do a good job of summarizing this in a clear and cogent way. But the way we want to become students of our life is to go over things and to go over things. And in that way, slowly and gradually, we acquire the expertise and the patience and the methods that can be really helpful for us in our life and helpful for the people in our lives as well.
Okay, so thanks, Lee. We do have a number of questions to get through, so I'm just gonna hop right in. So one of the questions is, what can I do to control my stress pertaining to the possible loss of my business and the uncertainty of the pandemic?
Yeah. Huge questions. And as I think, we've touched on already, the thought of losing a business is different from losing the business. The thought, and notice what goes on in your body as this really understandable and powerful movie begins to play in your mind. Notice how the body is feeling, how worked up we get. Okay. The stress of that pernicious rumination on how bad it's going to be, what this is going to mean, perhaps the embarrassment, the helplessness of it all. Right now, that is undermining and eroding your capacity to work with the conditions at hand. And we can also take a moment and realize, yes, I'm afraid. There's a lot of fear here. We can accept that we're afraid. And we can discern the difference between being afraid of an outcome and the fact that I'm here right now and there's much that I can do. If we can take stock of the presence of fear and just accept that fear is here. We don't need to push it to the side. We don't need to fight the fear, because fighting the fear is just more stress. It's more kindling on the fire. So as we can look at what we're experiencing in that fear, maybe we can take a few moments to just look at the nature of the fear. Are the thoughts that I'm having realistic? We can be frozen by fear. We can be arrested by it. And that isn't that adaptive when there may be other things that we can do. There may be people that we can call. There may be resources that we can go to. There may be people that we can pursue for support. So, if you can keep your head while all around you are losing theirs, that advice from Rudyard Kipling's poem, that can be pretty helpful in working with the fear of losing our business. I don't mean to be Pollyannish at all, because that wouldn't be reality. To say it's going to be fine, it may not be fine. We will be alive on the other side of this, hopefully. And whatever we arrive to meet, that is what life will be like at that time. The important thing to ruthlessly and with warrior-like courage to remind ourselves of is that I'm here now. And yes, there is fear. Of course, there is fear. There's nothing shameful about being afraid. But I can work with that, and I can look at what its nature is and discern the difference between the fear and the truth of the moment and the things that I might do to mitigate that imagined disaster. Looking after your body, looking after your mind, getting support, not isolating yourself, consulting with people that have been there before. All of these and so many other things can be helpful, while also ensuring that you're not undermining your resources and your abilities by drinking more, by distracting yourself with things that are not really providing you with great opportunities or adaptive moments. Yeah, so it's a really good question. It's a question that all of us are laboring with. It's workable, and we need to discern the difference between our imagination of a catastrophe and facing the conditions that are at hand right now in the most adaptive and value-laden ways.
Okay.
Back to you, Alana.
The next one is surrounding recommendations of resources to help people working from home and struggling with mental health during these times. So just resources that they can go to.
Right. There's so many resources we can go to. Struggling at home, for one, we really want to be entertaining and looking at the possibility of reaching out a little bit more and opening up with the people in our life already. Each of us could imagine, if I just asked all of you, who would you like to be able to open up with? Immediately our minds often offer up 1, 2, 3 people that we just inherently trust, but we may never have opened up with them before. So there is, again, some startup costs to doing new things, such as saying to somebody, I'm really feeling afraid. I'm feeling frightened. I'm feeling alone. I'm thinking things inside that are really scaring me. And it's something that we really need to do with each other. It's not just a nice slogan that we're in this together. And we have these sapient brains that are social. We are social mammals. Okay? So it's really vital in isolation that we continue reaching out to other people. And this experiment that I mentioned at the beginning of our smartphones and texting, we just haven't adapted texting or these other platforms that allows the nuance of voice inflection, of having the face right there, the eye contact, that really meets the needs that these mammalian brains of ours have. So the more we can reach out and connect with other people, we'll feel the better for it, even though there are those startup costs. It's also important to do things to look after our body, as I said. When we are in isolation, we can find all kinds of great yoga online. We can find all kinds of core workouts online and other ways in which we can work up, a sweat. We can get out for walks in a lot of different places. And that stuff is really, really helpful for our bodies. There is a ton of stuff online as well. There is counseling services that are offered virtually and by telephone. You may have that available to you through an extended health program, through an EAP at your workplace. To simply Google around, there's a lot of resources that you can find there. There is an app that I use for guided meditation. And when I teach mindfulness meditation, I encourage students to download the app called Insight Timer. It is free, and there are multiple lifetimes of guided meditations available there that can help you with reducing stress, helping to increase your capacity to pay attention. There are lots of talks given by a lot of terrific teachers that can continue to remind us of things that we are experiencing, going through, and to recognize that we're not going through this in some idiosyncratic way, that it's just me, but this is stuff that all of us are experiencing. So the internet is our friend right now, and it's also a bit of an enemy too, because it takes us away from important connection.
Okay, so Allie's wondering about research regarding the hippocampal capacity. She's not sure if she's using this right jargon there, but any predispositions or susceptibility to anxiety or PTSD.
What comes to mind, Allie, first of all, to roll it right back, we know that our early years and the extent to which anybody has experienced early childhood adversity or adverse childhood experiences, ACEs. And so this is really whether we've had bad luck in our formative years. We didn't choose the parents that we have. We didn't choose the socioeconomic level we grew up in. We didn't choose the degree to which our parents were psychologically and emotionally resolved or not. It's not our fault if we were hit or assaulted or abused in any way. The science is very clear, though, that the more there are adverse experiences, where there are complications in the attachment relationship in our young years, that is going to have predisposing effects on our vulnerability to maladaptive levels of stress later in life. This is heavy-duty stuff, but again, it's workable, but it is not subject generally to fast fixes. We do know that in children who have experienced early childhood abuse and maltreatment, their hippocampi are already smaller. There are already changes in the epigenetics, which is the way in which the genes are operating, the way in which proteins and the directions from the genes are transcribed into the body at a young age. And I know that when people have suffered, not through their fault or their choice, early childhood difficulties, it can be a long haul to understand how our history is continuing to express itself in the present. As we can get a hold of our stress, though, as we can begin to downregulate our stress reactions through responding to situations instead of reacting, the evidence is that there can be a lot of beneficial change, even at the gross level of the size of the hippocampi, in the course of a couple of months. For example, Sarah Lazar, a psychologist at Harvard Medical School, did volumetric MRIs of people's brains before and after they took an 8-week program in mindfulness meditation. And they showed that the hippocampi were larger at the end of those 10 weeks from the process of being able to see their stress, working with it more rationally, working with it more compassionately and with curiosity, and largely probably mediated by a downregulation of their cortisol levels going forward. But again, you know, our adulthood is the time in our life when we can come to terms with and work with our childhood and understand the things that we experienced. Or our adulthood is a time when much of our life is regulated by the things that were laid down, the ways in which our brain was hacked in our early childhood. So we can work with it now, or we can suffer it now. And these are projects that extend through the rest of our adulthood, because our minds and our lives and our the amount of conditioning that we've got inside our noggin is huge. And it's always so interesting, or it can become very interesting to see its expression over and over again. And what can start to happen quickly is we become empowered by it. We recognize it more quickly. We can respond to our difficult history. And in that way, we can't erase what's on our mind or what's in our brain, but we can become the boss of the show far more effectively and robustly.
Okay. I believe you already touched on this, but Bill is asking, is there any specific...
Who is that again, Alana?
Bill.
Bill?
He's asking any specific coping mechanisms specific to the pandemic environment.
Specific coping mechanisms in the pandemic. Again, I think, Bill, we have to look at connecting with each other and letting the isolation in effect be virtual and physical, but not psychological. Stay at home. You know, there's an old Buddhist nugget of wisdom that says, if you want to feel happier, do something kind for someone else. And our isolation at this time is a way in which we look after each other. So to go out and to wear a mask is a way of looking after the people around you. And the people around you wearing a mask are looking after you. Our isolation is something that is necessary because, as I understand it, this virus is not well understood. It's not well measured. The antibodies are not understood. We don't understand about infection rates. And while the virus itself may not be incredibly menacing in terms of base rates of serious illness and death, It's the rate at which it can communicate to other people is huge. Comparisons to the flu and this virus, they talk about the R factor, which is how communicable it is. Regular flu is like 1.3, and I don't know, I think that the coronavirus is pegged at about 3. Doesn't sound like a big difference in numbers, but if you multiply 1.3, which is the number of people, if you had the flu and you exposed yourself to 10 people, 1.3 of those people would get the flu. So if you do that 10 times to look at how that could propagate through a population, multiply 1.3 times 1.3 times 1.3 10 times, and you'll get a number like 14 or 15, I think. With the coronavirus, multiply 3 times 3 times 3, 10 times, and you get 59,000. That's a big difference. So what it risks is shutting down the hospitals. If this stuff just goes on, we will wake up one day and it would be like a world where there are no hospitals and all health issues become a peril. That happened in New York. So we're going to have to be isolated for a while. I don't want to make prognostications on that because we don't have any that are good right now. It's not going to be quick. So we need to, work with these initial startup costs to venture into new ways of relating to people, to start doing a lot of Zoom, just to be sitting or working in your kitchen, cutting vegetables with somebody else there that you can laugh with and you can see their face. That is a great way to work in isolation, to embrace some of the startup costs of, picking up the guitar again, or starting to read things that you've always wanted to read, to pursue the novelty in the time that we have, and to not allow the time that we have to be turned into confetti through all of the partial bit things that we do. So that involves some mindful regulation of just what am I doing with my time, taking stock of what do I really want, to really listen to what matters in your heart, and to let that start providing you with some abiding direction.
Okay.
Quick answer to a big question, a really good question.
Before we get into our last question, quickly, okay. Francis is asking if you could repeat the name of the researcher from Harvard.
Oh, Sarah Lazar, Lazar. This stuff has been replicated a lot. Functional magnetic resonance imaging and volumetric magnetic resonance imaging are the tools at hand. These are in the academic journals that not everybody has access to. But if you do a search online of cortisol in the hippocampus, you'll find a lot of material there, which should help with sleep at night.
All right, so the last question is from Dawn. If you know someone is stressed, their performance is being seriously impacted, their physical health is being impacted, but they refuse to acknowledge that they need help, is there any suggestions on how to support them?
I think the first thing that we can do with ourselves and with each other is to really, bring our compassion into play. One of the things about being stressed, as most of us, I think are, I noticed that this has affected me. I got angry with the bananas the other day as they bumped the glass of water I was carrying. I mean, that was a tell for me that, yeah, I'm getting a bit reactive here. But one of the things that we can bring out is our compassion for ourselves and others, and to recognize that it can be very hard to simply even see that we're stressed. This is the water. And so to simply offer our kindness is a big help. When we are stressed, we may feel distressed when we see other people are distressed. The neuroscience on this is quite clear, that we experience other people's pain through our own pain systems. So we may have less patience and tolerance when other people are distressed because it makes us feel bad. So being patient, slowing it down, offering the safety of compassion instead of perhaps the implicit judgment of why don't you do something for yourself, even when that's offered kindly, may be a way forward. And to persist with the compassion, but also recognizing that we can't run other people's lives. We can care for them, but ultimately each of us is the only one that can work with and make the biggest difference in our own lives. So whether we offer our compassion just through, offering recognition of how we value somebody, through heartfelt, a gift of some kind, just offering somebody some of your own generosity, talking about personal experience, a kind note, just trying to reach in a different way, but recognizing that it's not on you to make some critical, fundamental difference in another person.
Okay, so that was our last question. So thanks so much, Lee. I'm quickly just going to go through some stuff that's coming up. So this Friday, we're having our first virtual power breakfast on economic impact and the anticipated shifts from COVID. Wednesday, May 6th at 12, we have a business and financial planning workshop. On May 14th, we have a digital marketing and selling during COVID workshop with Rose Terry. All of that can be found on our social media, so Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. But yeah, so I did send a link out to the survey. You'll get one to your email around 1:30. Lee, do you have any last words for today's session?
I might. Let me see what's in there. The one thing I want to leave you with is that our life, even under these present conditions, and even if we're bringing other things to the party, it's workable. There are ways in which we can run around like a chicken with its head cut off. That's not particularly helpful. We can recognize how difficult it is to overcome the initial inertia of doing new things and of reaching out and connecting and of participating in things that are meaningful, and to look after our body. But be patient with yourself and bring a lot of that compassion and curiosity to bear. And it can be surprising moment by moment where that might take us.
Wonderful. Thanks so much.
My pleasure.
All right, we'll see you guys all on the next Zoom workshop. See ya.